Welcome to Awareness to Action, a podcast brought to you by the Northwestern Community Services Board Prevention Department. I'm your host, Casey, a social worker and prevention specialist here in Virginia. Our podcast goal is to promote wellness through conversation, connection, and action. We hope each episode will leave you feeling inspired and motivated to look for ways to get involved in your own community. Today's episode is particularly exciting because it's our first with two guests. Joining me are Eric Benson and Megan Gordon, who both serve the youth and families of Page County, Virginia. As Assistant Superintendent of Instruction, Innovation, and Accountability for Page County Public Schools, Eric has a unique perspective on the role of trauma-informed education. And Megan serves as the Program Director for Page Alliance for Community Action, a substance misuse prevention coalition, giving her years of experience in partnering with schools from a community standpoint. Basically, these two work toward the same goal from complementary approaches, which is what makes this conversation with both of them feel so meaningful. In this episode, we'll touch on trauma-informed education, the importance of community partnerships, and ways that everyone can be involved in the education of young people. We recorded this episode amidst the pandemic, so Megan, Eric, and I chatted over Zoom, which explains some of the extra noises you might hear throughout this episode. All right, Megan and Eric, welcome to the Awareness to Action podcast. I'm so happy to have both of you here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. We're excited to be here.
I think it's always good for our listeners to know about who they're hearing from. So why don't you both share a bit about the work you've done in the past and then tell us about the roles you're in now. And Eric, why don't you start?
Okay. Good afternoon, listeners. My name is Eric Benson. I actually began teaching here in Page County in 2002. So this does make my 19th year working in education. I began as a third grade teacher and moved into a high school administrative role. And now I currently serve Page County as an Assistant Superintendent of Instruction, Innovation, and Accountability.
Good afternoon. My name is Megan Gordon, and I began my work with Page County Public Schools in 2009, I believe, as an assistant at the elementary school. Then I worked my way to the central office. I was the secretary for the superintendent, and I managed state and federal grants. And that kind of brought me to working as a parent representative with our local youth substance misuse prevention coalition, PACA, Page Alliance for Community Action. There, I became the program director in 2015 when we received some drug-free community grants funding, and I have been with PACA as the program director ever since.
So basically, both of you are picture-perfect examples of turning awareness to action and letting that guide your path, which I love. So today we're really going to be diving into trauma-informed education and what that means. So there's been a big emphasis on trauma-informed education in the past few years. And before we really get into what that looks like in practice, I'd love for you to tell our listeners what it means for a school or a county to be trauma-informed.
Okay, I'll go ahead and start. I first off would say that trauma is something that impacts both learning and behavior for our students. And so the goal is always this past year was to create trauma-informed resilient schools in effort to assist those children that experience quite a bit of trauma. We always are looking for ways to have learning not be such a struggle. And I think once you identify the root of the behavior, so where that trauma is coming from, then our teachers and our educators can adapt their approach to help kids to begin to cope at school. For those that are not aware, trauma can come in the form of any sort of toxic stress experiences, and often they can result from poverty, bullying, or addiction. And I believe all three of those factors influence our Page County students.
And I kind of look at it too, coming from the community, the public health side of it. Becoming trauma informed can change the understanding of yourself, your loved ones, and those who you work with daily. So it's understanding the impact of stress and what it has on the individuals and in our community health as a whole. So, and it's hoping to, and I know Eric's going to talk about this a little bit today too, but it's shifting the mindset and to a positive intent. So to help bring in empathy, compassion, and love as a community, to have everybody in the community talking and speaking the same language. That is the hope. And we started really talking to the school system about it, because that's where we reach our kids and the largest part of the population we're trying to working with the youth, but it's trying to get everybody to come from that same mindset in the whole community.
Casey, I think as educators, it's important that our listeners realize that not only are we tasked with providing content knowledge and making sure that students demonstrate progress academically, but also that we develops children's social and emotional skills as well as they face life outside of K-12 education.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, Eric, because we all know that school doesn't last forever, and that it really is an opportunity to prep young people for the world. So what did it look like for Page County to start incorporating trauma-informed practices into the culture of the schools?
So one of the things that we noticed from our teachers early on is when we had difficult situations happening at school, the teacher's natural reaction was to ask, what's wrong with that student? And we began working in teams or in our individual buildings, trying to diagnose, what's wrong with that child. And I believe as part of becoming a trauma-informed resilient school, we shifted that question from what's wrong with that student to what has happened or what is happening to that student. And when we did that, we really did focus on what we refer to as the 3 E's. And the 3 E's refer to as the event, the experience, and the effect. The event being, what was the single occurrence or what has happened repeatedly over time. For many of our teachers, they work with students who have various backgrounds or socioeconomic status. And those things affect children in different ways. So as children began to respond or things happen differently, our teachers needed to begin to ask themselves, why is that? And it really comes down to the fact that children have different levels of resilience. So as we thought about those events that were happening, we then looked at the experiences. It is the experience or the perception of the event by the child that determines whether or not that's traumatic. So there were some certain lessons that we needed our teachers to remember as part of that work. First off, I think we needed to make sure our teachers never assumed that something small isn't traumatic. I think that's important. Secondly, never to assume that something awful is also traumatic. And then third, the child's perception of their event or their experience is not our experience. And as we started to educate our staff, we really needed to keep those 3 lessons kind of at the forefront. And then the last E, the effect, how that experience influences or has an effect on that event. We as educators feel like our schools are an opportune system for prevention and early intervention. And it's our responsibility to work across multiple domains to make sure students do have a positive outcome. And so when school professionals see students through a trauma-informed, resilient lens and begin to recognize the impact of trauma, we start to meet the goals that we set out as educators to have. And that is to improve students' ability to learn, their ability to connect with others, and then hopefully develop resilience.
Eric, those 3 E's feel really important to me because, and I'm glad you shared them because they can't really be separated? How can we understand trauma if we're only looking at the event, or we're only looking at the effect and we're not connecting the dots? And I also really appreciate what you said about not making assumptions with trauma, because it's, we talk about trauma-informed education, and I think that can sometimes feel like a solidified, unchanging concept, but really it's so individualized. It requires great care for each person and how each person has experienced life. And in the case of the schools, how each student has experienced life. So I think those 3 E's feel important to me.
And I would add, Casey, that, as we try to meet students' basic needs on kind of a Maslow's hierarchy, and provide them, in recent years, there's been efforts to make sure students have the proper nutrition, for instance, at school. And so our school-based food nutritional services have increased dramatically to make sure that's happened. I think could put social emotional development right in the mix with those sorts of things in terms of basic needs. Students just no longer come to school to learn, and school functions in a lot of other different ways than just a place to learn academic or content knowledge and skills. And so as we've done that, we need to make sure that there was some groundwork for our teachers in terms of the 3 E's and those 3 lessons, also to make sure that we were kind of all working from the same page.
Yeah, and that perfectly brings me to what I wanted to talk about next, which is Page County's 10 trauma-informed steps. You all have 10 steps that guide the work that you're doing, and I'm going to read them for listeners because I think they're really incredible. So the steps are: 1, focusing on resilience; 2, understand trauma as an experience; 3, foster connections; 4, prioritize social and emotional skill development; 5, establish safety; 6, promote play and breaks; 7, believe the link between private logic and behavior; 8, partner with families and community; 9, support and invest in staff; and 10, collect and utilize outcome data. So I just want to focus on a few of those in particular. I would love to do a deep dive into all 10, but let's just talk about a couple. And let's start with social emotional learning. So can you define that and give us some examples of that learning in the classroom?
Sure. I would define social emotional learning as the process by which we recognize and manage our emotions. And as part of that development, one of the first things we did was kind of look at the research behind why that is important for our students. Why is participating in social emotional programs important? I think if you were to ask a classroom teacher, one of the things that they would say they struggle most with is the lack of time. So anytime you're giving up time for something else, taking time away from the academic content that needs to be delivered, you need to make sure that that time is important, that the other use of that time is important. And so as we looked at how do we enhance and develop students' social emotional skills, we saw some things that were direct consequences when that occurred. The first thing that we made sure our staff was aware of was that students kind of have improved attitudes towards themselves, the school, and others. And we know that sometimes when students are disruptive or we have behavior issues at school, sometimes that is the root cause of what's happening. Secondly, we saw that there was an enhanced positive social behavior that occurred when social emotional curriculum was part of school programs. There was reduced conduct problems, so whether that meant misbehavior or aggression or some of the other things that often would take away from learning. So if time was invested for social emotional, then maybe we would get some time back on academically because we wouldn't have the behavior disruptions that are occurring. And then finally, we saw that students improve academic performance, whether it means a test score or grade when social emotional. So after we looked at that research, we made a concerted effort to make sure that social emotional programs were part of all 3 levels. I guess I would say part of the elementary level, middle, and high school level. This isn't something that you kind of age out of. And we made sure that there was time set forth in our master schedule for this sort of work to occur. When social emotional learning becomes part of their curriculum, I would say first and foremost, students start to change their mindset. They change their mindset from they're a victim of trauma to now they're starting to think about they're a survivor of trauma. And anytime you can change a student's mindset, that's a pretty powerful thing to have happen. As part of our social emotional work, there are really two important cornerstones that we recognize as part of SEL competence. Emotional awareness, the first cornerstone, and then emotional regulation being the second one. Emotional awareness is a student's ability to recognize one's emotions and thoughts and their influence on behavior. And then emotional regulation is a little bit different. That's a student's ability to regulate their emotions, thoughts, and behaviors effectively when faced with a different situation. And thinking about our teachers and equipping them with strategies, we went away from time out and spent more time working on a time in strategy. So if a student had misbehaved, often maybe a teacher may send them to a detention or have them sit out in the hallway, where the teacher now has some skills or tools to be able to attack that situation with and respond and really get next to that student and try to make a positive difference rather than sending them to a different location.
I'm glad you talk about, these aren't things that we age out of. I mean, emotional awareness and emotional regulation are necessary always, every day for our entire lives. So kind of related to that concept of aging out, one of these steps is play. And I'm hoping that you can speak to why play is important and how you incorporate play into school for older students.
Well, when you ask most people to think about their experience at school, they probably remember recess or play as part of their elementary experience. And often as students get older and move into middle or high school, that time period often will disappear. I think the dilemma is that schools often will face is your again, time. Do you take away time to work on academic subjects in order to give time to accommodate recess? And so we again looked at some research and thought about that investment in time. And for the 2020-21 school year, we decided to bring recess back to the middle school. We feel like that time, giving students regularly scheduled, unstructured physical activity, breaks in instructional time, was more important than just hammering away and plowing through some of that content like teachers often like to do. And so we have already been able to reap the benefits of that. We have already heard from teachers that students are more attentive when they come back to the learning of the content information. They're able to perform cognitively just a little bit better. And so again, thinking back to those cornerstones of our SEL programs, play was a way to, or recess was a way to promote that emotional regulation, an opportunity for students to foster connections by giving them an opportunity to engage with peers that they might not have had when maybe the teacher standing at the front of the room delivering the lecture, or they're working in small groups on some sort of an activity. I think another unintended consequence of bringing recess or play back to the middle school level is we really have seen an improvement in overall school climate, which has been really something positive. It's allowed students to develop their communication skills, cooperation, sharing, all of those things that you maybe would say historically go along with your elementary years. Students have continued to develop. And we've seen that through a data point. I would say if you spoke to one of our middle school administrators, they would say middle school discipline has never been as low as it's ever been. And so we feel like some of that is because of the fact that we brought recess back.
The last step in your 10 steps that I wanted to talk about was partnering with families, because I know that it matters. I also know that it's probably more challenging right now than ever before because we are in this pandemic. So Paige is doing really incredible work through the Porch Visit grant, and I'm hoping that one or both of you can explain what the Porch Visit grant is, and why it matters.
The school system, like I've said before, is just an amazing partner, one of our amazing partners in the community. And they approached us, the nutritional services approached us about partnering to try to receive funds to provide porch visits to families. And it tied in exactly to what our mission is. And it seemed to fit perfect. Obviously, our goal is to reduce substance misuse in the community with our youth. And part of that is getting down to exactly what Eric was talking about, the root cause. And the root causes often tie back to trauma. And part of helping to heal and provide resources is making connections, having positive relationships. One positive relationship, can make a difference. So the Porch Visit seemed to fit perfect. So we're partnering with Page County Public Schools Nutrition, Page County Sheriff's Office, Healthy Families of Page County, and the Virginia Cooperative Extension to provide meals to families that are identified or families that have called to receive the service. In addition to the meals that they receive weekly, we have staff that they're having conversations. They're just going and doing exactly what it says, having conversations with the family members to see what other resources are needed, things that they need. And a lot of things have been, a lot of what they're saying that they need, they need connection. They need somebody to talk to. They need tutoring help for their school age kids. They need additional food, additional household goods that they just can't, make ends meet. We're helping them apply for services that they may not have known they qualified for, or they may not know how to get the services. So we're trying to help them assist with getting services through social services. Some of them need access to Wi-Fi, help with utilities. So the Porch Visits, it's a way for us to provide food for the families, and then to provide the relationships, to make the connections, and then hopefully provide the resources that can help them. It was something that would have been exciting without COVID-19, without the pandemic, and it would have been needed and something that we really wanted to do. But considering and in light of kind of just how the pandemic has affected and impacted many of our families, it is something that is definitely needed in the community right now.
It makes me think of the phrase, "It takes a village," which is such a cliche, but cliches are cliches for good reason. And both of you have spoken so beautifully to the interconnectedness of schools and staff, student families, and the community. And it sounds like that's really being prioritized in Page County. So I want to ask you in a similar vein about how different individuals in the community can build partnerships with schools to create better educational opportunities for students. So first, let me ask about how parents and family members of students can best offer support and remain engaged with their students' education and the broader school environment.
I think that's a pretty simple answer, believe it or not, Casey. I think it starts with having a conversation with their child every single day. There's a lot that can be learned by asking students when they come home every day, how was school today? By talking to children and about their day and maybe possibly some of the interests or things that happened. That's a pretty simple step for folks to go through. If you have an opportunity or time each evening or at some point throughout the day to help a child complete their school work or assignments, maybe possibly read together, you start to also learn a little bit more. If you can move that forward to saying school's important, you need to, our parents and our families need to communicate that they have high expectations, high educational expectations for children. And I think that's kind of maybe three initial things. We are always looking for people to volunteer and assist us in our schools, come out and attend school events. And I think that just kind of plays out a little bit differently for each individual. Sometimes that's harder for parents to get to. But I think whether or not you have a child in the school system or you are a parent of a student in the school system, it all starts with a conversation.
Yeah, I agree. I think just taking the time to have the conversations, and even if you don't have a kid in the school system, maybe you have nieces or nephews or grandkids, or ask them, see how you can get involved, talk to them about their day, talk to them about the importance of education, and then just go and get involved. I know you had talked about communities and how the broader community can get involved. And there's a lot of ways that community members, business members, retired, Eric mentioned about volunteering, retired members of the community, a local church members can be involved in education and help to provide the students in Page County with the resources that they need.
Casey, I failed to mention one final step, and I think this really goes along with the idea of creating trauma-informed, resilient schools, and that is we needed to be able to begin to educate our parents about trauma. And I think there were 5 things that I'd like to mention here today that we said to our parents or have said to our parents that I think are really important and need to be repeated here today. The first step, or the first thing we said, is please be understanding. Trauma is like no other experience for these students in their life. The second thing we said to them was to be patient. Trauma can destroy a child's sense of safety and security. So patience is going to be very important. To be nurturing, to encourage parents to spend time interacting in a meaningful way each and every day with their children. The fourth step, to be simple. Often parents feel like they need to do something complex to help or make their child's lives better, but can it be simple things and start by doing 1 or 2 things each and every day. And then the last step is just to be normal. Tell parents to reassure them that their child's reactions are normal following a traumatic experience. Often parents may want to go out and find a professional counselor or some sort of other service immediately when these things are happening. And we often want to remind our parents just to be calm and be normal, that these are everyday things that are happening for everyone.
I want to add on to Casey. Eric helped me remember to make sure to remind parents and community members in general to take care of yourself, that we can't take care of anybody else until we've taken care of ourselves. And to just make a change. Hopefully everybody wants to change the world, but you can do that by changing your little piece of it. So take small steps and make sure you really take care of yourself.
You both just shared so many great little nuggets. The 2 that I really want to highlight, Megan, is your what you shared about this being for everyone. Involvement in the schools. I think it's really easy to say, oh, well, I don't have a child in the school, so that's not for me to get involved with. But it really is on all of us to be investing in our young people. So I love that you shared that. And Eric, I love what you said about keeping it simple. I think we really stop ourselves sometimes from getting engaged when we feel like we need to have all the answers or we need to know exactly how to do the perfect thing, when really just showing up and wanting to get engaged is usually enough. We're coming to the end of our time, and we ask one question of all of our guests. And as I said earlier, I think both of you have modeled this process in your individual careers. And I think it's really clear that Page County is going through this process in the context of trauma-informed care. So what does the process of awareness to action mean to you? And Megan, I'll put you on the spot and have you go first.
I just think it means, making sure we continue to educate and move forward. That everybody knows about the importance of trauma informed, and that we move to be trauma supportive, that we continue to build the skills that we need. We continue to help build the skills in the community, that we move our community from not only being trauma informed, but being a trauma supportive community, and where we're leading, our mindset's positive. We're leading with empathy and love and compassion.
Casey, for me, I really tried to focus on the two words, awareness and action. And so when I think about the word awareness, I think about developing an understanding of childhood trauma and how trauma can adversely influence learning and behavior. And then when I think about the word action, I think about then equipping individuals with specific tools to create trauma-informed, resilient environments. I think it's important that our listeners know that all students need a safe and supportive schools that can respond to the effects of trauma and toxic stress in order for learning to happen.
Well, thank you both for sharing what that process means to you and for being here today. It just gives me great hope to think about trauma-informed care being incorporated into education and how that will transform our world. It brings me great hope, and I'm grateful for people like you who are doing the work. So thank you for the work you do. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in. If you're interested in learning more about trauma-informed education, we've linked some information and resources in the episode description. And make sure you subscribe to Awareness to Action so you can be the first to hear from the incredible guests we're going to have on the show this month.